The labor movement in the U.S. has been at the forefront of political and cultural battles that have fundamentally shaped our lives. Far beyond Labor Day, unions and working class political organizations have helped get a 5-day work week, outlawed child laborers in dangerous situations, and ensured basic safety measures for employees across industries. Despite this history of activism, labor and environmental organizers have often been viewed as at odds with each other over the last several decades. But labor and environmentalists share many of the same concerns, from a desire to reduce health risks to a commitment to meaningful, fair jobs that can survive a changing economy in the midst of climate change. Today on the show, we're talking about the connections between the labor movement and the environment, how the two can work together, and what futures such coalitions could bring for everyone. Later in the hour, our researcher Siena has a piece on resilience infrastructure in Houston. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. For our conversation around labor today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Claire Ravenscroft, Assistant Professor of American Literature and American Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan, and Dr. Casey Williams, Lecturer in Environmental Studies at Rice University. Dr. Ravenscroft, Dr. Williams, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
Thanks so much, Weston.
Great. So just to start off, I think both of you think about a large array of environmental issues and advocacy and kind of climate justice concerns. But to start us off, what I'd really love to think about is some work that you did thinking really specifically around labor and how the labor movement can be involved with the climate justice movement, but also some of the obstacles and blockages that maybe prevent labor organizations and working class folks in general who have a real stake in environmental concerns, but are often also, in a precarious place enough that it becomes difficult to engage in certain ways. So maybe if you can start off and just talk us through a little bit, what is the significance of, the labor movement broadly and their relationship to environmental work, but where is a starting place for labor to start moving in more in these spaces?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for having us, Weston, and that's a great place to start, I think. It's worth saying that in the U.S., at least, there's been a sense, really going back to the 1960s, that labor groups and environmental groups are on opposite sides of a range of issues. The idea being that where environmental groups are interested in things like preservation and environmental quality, labor is more or less attached to what are sometimes called productivist ideas about development, about the necessity of economic growth and modernization for the progress and benefit of the working class, but also a nation or a global society. And so part of what Claire and I have been trying to do for several years in different ways is complicate this idea and insist that actually the labor movement and the environmental movement not only have been on the same side practically in a number of conflicts over the last few decades, but are in principle always on the same side. And the reason, fundamentally the reason is that workers, even if they work in industries that are considered dirty, extractive industries, fossil fuel production and refining, distribution, that kind of thing, they have an interest that they share with everyone else, especially every other member of their class, in clean, habitable, safe environments in which they can live, which they can raise their kids, and imagine a future for themselves, their families, and their neighborhoods. And what's unique about labor, not only does it have this interest, which is the interest of the working class as a whole, but really even beyond that, they have a particular kind of leverage. So because workers in all kinds of industries are depended upon to produce the things that we use on a daily basis, to move them around, to make sure that we can buy them and get the things that we need, they have a key source of power in the current economy. And by making use of that power, principally by withdrawing their labor, so the strike, but other kinds of work stoppages, they're able to exert pressure on businesses and on governments in favor of policies that might advance broader ecological interests. So that's kind of the theory here. We can talk a little bit about the specifics if you want also.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that this piece that we wrote for the New Republic is about this one particular protest that was happening in D.C. on I-95 last summer of 2023, which to us, it was essentially a group called Declare Emergency. They sat on the highway and blocked traffic as a way of raising awareness about global warming and raising awareness about government inaction to curb carbon emissions and transition the economy onto alternative energy. And, this protest really speaks to this historic rift that Casey's talking about between labor and environmentalism, insofar as, the actual visual of this protest is climate activists sitting on the highway versus, hardworking Americans who are driving their cars trying to get to work. And so, this specific incident becomes a really clear crystallization of this dynamic, but also of where its limits are, As Casey says, workers have a very objective material interest in decarbonizing the economy, not least of which because they are essentially held hostage by fossil fuels in the form of needing to drive to work every day. Even, people who are working class, who believe in climate change, who care about climate change, who want to take action on climate change, their opportunities to actually remove themselves from fossil fuel supply chains or from fossil fuel requiring activities that generate carbon emissions, those opportunities are very small, right? You actually don't have a lot of choice in your everyday life to break from that dependency. And so kind of beyond raising people's awareness about climate change or about the need to transition the economy, what we also need to raise awareness about is that bind that people get put in, right? The fact that as the economy and our society is currently configured, you don't really have that many opportunities for action. And raising awareness about that can be a point of agitation that can lead us to other sorts of strategies, like the ones Casey's talking about, refusing labor power, blockading infrastructure, and those sorts of activities.
So I want to hone in a little bit on some of what you were just talking about. And I think there's in the piece, it's certainly, and everyone should go read it. It's on the New Republic's website. You do a really fascinating kind of deep dive into this protest and thinking about different forms of activism. But something that I think you're really hitting on that is a real concern for people in a lived experience, as Casey was pointing to, the idea that, the environmental movement and labor and working class folks are not intrinsically linked when we know that it's working class folks who are most impacted by these issues. We're thinking of Houston, right? It's you have to have a car to drive around to get to your job, and simultaneously our air quality is terrible in Houston. Nothing gets Houstonians riled up faster than telling them their air quality is worse than Los Angeles. I'm like, what? That can't. But yeah, it's been the story for a hot minute. And so, in thinking of that, realizing these are issues that obviously directly affect people, but also people who are, exactly as you were saying, really reliant on their cars to get to work and really, have to get to work in a way that, I've at various points in Houston had the luxury of making public transit work for me. But I also really get when I have to come onto campus, it would be a 10, 15-minute drive for me on the weekend when the buses only run once an hour, and if I happen to have missed it, it's suddenly a 2-hour commute for me. And so I'm curious about what are some of the things that you've identified and you're thinking about, especially infrastructurally, which you both write on, that are both blockages to folks getting involved, but also places that we should consider. These are things that need to be addressed so that we can bring working class folks more and more into this fight and not have it feel like we are attacking or accosting people who are just trying to live their lives.
Yeah, all of that is super real. I think the reason that this story was so compelling to me is because, I was visiting my family in D.C. when it was happening, and all of my family members need to drive to do their work. And this is even in D.C., which compared to a lot of other American cities actually does have, quite extensive public transit or mass transit. And, kind of picturing them as the people who would get stopped by this protest and thinking, well, they would get stopped. That would ruin their day. That could actually, make a pretty serious difference in the kind of money they make or whether they are able to keep their job. But they do believe in climate change. They do support a green agenda. They're not the enemies of these protesters. They're quite literally on the same side. But, when you look at them, these images of the protest, it makes them seem like they have opposing interests. And so I think that's why it kind of hit home for me, the sort of binds that people get put into. I think also some of these limits have become clear to me. I live in Tokyo, Japan now, which has a really extensive train and bus system. I have never even one time thought about getting a car or even driving a car. Every time I take a cab, it's basically against my will, and I'd rather rely on my own 2 feet or my bicycle or other ways of getting around the city. And the reason for that is because it is always the more convenient option. It is always the quicker option. It is always the more affordable option. And so I think making that decision for people, as you're describing, not a kind of vexing, difficult, guilt-ridden decision of, impossible options, but instead a no-brainer, which is what it is for me every day. That's really key for green energy transition being feasible for transportation.
Yeah, and I think, moving away from thinking about, green living as a set of ethical choices that we make in thinking infrastructurally and thinking systemically, and recognizing that people's relationship to fossil fuels is mostly not one that they choose. It's mostly one that emerges from a set of constraints that are imposed on them by the conditions in which they live. And precisely as you say, those constraints are most intense for people with the least amounts of social power and who are most directly affected by the immediate consequences of the fossil fuel industry, in the form of pollution, but also some of the broader, longer-term consequences when we think about the uneven distribution of climate change's impacts. And in a city like Houston, I was reading, in Houston, 86% of people drive to work. And this is higher than in a number of other American cities. And it tells you that this is a kind of infrastructural reliance that people have, and we have to acknowledge that. So then the question becomes, okay, we're thinking systemically. We understand that people's choices are constrained. What kinds of ethics or politics are available to a broad kind of working class movement to try to change those conditions? And I think the answer has to be thinking about where labor groups and environmental justice groups specifically have mutual interests, and thinking about where they have leverage. And I was talking earlier about the leverage that comes from the withdrawal of labor power, but really in a lot of places in the South, strikes are not really on the table currently. Unions aren't developed enough, although people are trying, developed enough for that to be the prominent or predominant vector of political, exercising political power. So, how do people intervene at the city level? Houston actually has a Metro Next program that is intending to expand the rail and bus lines in the city. Thinking about how to intervene in that process politically, but also through public demonstrations, using the tactics that are available to social movements to influence those plans and their development in a way that actually serve working class needs, so that, as Claire says, public transit is the most convenient option. It's the one that actually goes to the places where people live and takes them to the places where they work and gets them there quickly and efficiently, and reduces pollution in their neighborhoods. Those are some strategies for a city, broader or thinking nationally. Say, there's an organization of unionized rail workers called Rail Workers United, which is advocating for the public ownership of rail lines across the nation, so that the federal government could more easily expand Amtrak. Expand commuter rail. And there are currently plans to expand commuter rail dramatically in this city or in this country, and they've consistently been opposed by freight operators. And it's because the rail lines are privately owned that the freight operators have the ability to do that. So if you have organized labor in the rail industry thinking about how it can use its power to influence federal legislation to make rail more, if not totally publicly owned, at least have the federal government exert more control over how it is developed, that would make a huge difference for not just those workers, but everyone who currently depends on cars to get around.
I think that's interesting because it's awesome. I mean, it does to some degree, certainly labor power in the South is weaker. It's been nationally weaker for decades. That's not a new story. But I think something that, turning to the example of rail becomes actually locally interesting again, though, and that one of the kind of pilot projects that's being much heralded is a high-speed rail project between Dallas and Houston. And thinking of the Texas Triangle, which rail experts tend to really point to as a very viable zone for this kind of work, and creating new systems around that. And something that the folks will absolutely point out there is we heavily subsidize highways. We heavily subsidize forms of infrastructure as it is. And so it's really less about, okay, where this doesn't work because, we tried funding it at a very minute level and it didn't take off. And it's, well, if we're looking at the fact that you gave $30 billion to infrastructure projects related to highways in Texas this year and you gave, $100 million to bike infrastructure, we're not really comparing apples to apples here. But some of it you're talking about as well, which we've talked a fair amount about urban planning on the show and some of these various aspects in previous episodes. But something that I would point out is this is actually quite popular. In Houston, there were numbers that came out, I believe, last week. The Kinder Institute pointed to saying 60% of Houstonians want more mixed-use housing environments. They want more transit development where they can really have options for, yes, I want to walk, yes, I want to bike. That these are popular measures that have a kind of appeal across a range of different people, but also would make some of what you're talking about possible. So I know in your article, one of the things you pointed to is yes, the way that rail workers are mobilizing. Can you point us to other examples where labor or working class folks, have these kind of commonalities with environmental or climate issues and are mobilizing in ways to really think strategically about how they want to be involved, how they want to leverage political action to both the benefit of, I think something that folks fear is not just, oh, you're going to take my car away, but also, you're going to take my job away. And that's not a place the climate movement wants or should go, because it's not viable.
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing is there are actually lots of examples from a lot of different industries.
Excellent. I thought you might have some.
And let's just take the most recent high-profile labor fight in the U.S., the UAW rolling strike against the big three automakers. Part of what this fight was about was UAW workers saying, and to be clear, they were saying we're on board with a green energy transition. We are on board with the transition to EVs. We understand that climate change is a problem. And in fact, some of our communities are the ones that are facing potentially the worst consequences of climate change. We're on board. We just need to make sure this transition happens in a way that protects our members' interests and protects the interests of our communities in the cities and towns where we live. And they were very, very deliberate about working with climate change and climate justice organizations in the U.S. to think about what a just transition to electric vehicles and battery storage specifically would look like for their members. And, they formed these networks. They had, members of 350.org on their picket lines. They were doing educational programming. And really what they're saying is this transition can't be an excuse to de-skill labor. And it can't be an excuse to pay people.
What do you mean by de-skill labor?
De-skill labor. So the concern is that because workers currently have very specialized skills in assembly and producing automobiles, there's some concern that electric vehicles might be less technically complicated to produce, and that the transition might allow the automakers to rely on less skilled labor, and really the concern is that people will be paid less. because they're not doing, work that meets a certain kind of skill level. And, what they're saying and what they've been saying is that, we have the skills that can be applied to the production of EVs. We're ready to be trained on the new skills that we'll need. And we have a lot of ideas about how this should be produced, where, and want to be a part of those decisions about how it's done. So this is not to say that there aren't difficulties, that this will be a smooth transition, that there aren't differences in the kinds of skills that are required or where, materials are sourced from or where vehicles will be produced. The point, though, is that workers are on board. They just want to be part of the decision-making process and want to make sure that their interests are protected as we transition. And part of that, might just look like expanding the industry in a way that creates new jobs. It's important, though, and I'll just say one more thing on this, that industries shouldn't be thought of in isolation. So it's totally possible that the U.S. can produce sufficient electric vehicles to meet demand without as much labor.
I'll also just throw in there that also if they're increasing productivity, oftentimes comes along with reducing their actual worker pool as well. So to your point on labor that, we're being more productive, but can we do it with even fewer people? The entire time you were talking, actually, I was flashing back to some episodes we recently ran on the history of industrial farming, and I'm like, this is the exact same thing we literally did with beef and pork, and we're talking about cars and trains, and so I really appreciate the nod across industry. But
we could also imagine, as various iterations of the Green New Deal have proposed, job creation programs that take their model from the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps that employ people in good, unionized, well-paying jobs to do all of the things that we need to do to deal with and prepare for climate change and the energy transition. Coastal restoration, infrastructure development, wetlands remediation, transit build out. All of these things require workers, require people to work, and they could be very, very good jobs. And, if there's some reduction in labor need in automobile manufacturing, that might not be a bad thing. If people have other work to do and they feel that it respects them, gives them a source of pride and integrity, and it respects their skills, and they had a say in determining what that work looks like. And that's part of why it's important to think structurally and think at the national level.
Yeah, just to add to that, you took the words right out of my mouth. I feel like the Green New Deal has been kind of sidelined over the past 5 years, the U.S. dealing with COVID and, other sorts of crises. We kind of forgot about this huge, ambitious set of climate policies that were, explicitly designed to tether union rights, job creation, not de-skilled, casual jobs, but good union skilling jobs to, robust climate policies having to do with energy infrastructure and community resilience in the face of disasters, and also lots of, big picture policies that, these that similarly have a kind of majority support by Americans, right? Like healthcare, housing.
The history of the 20th century is in many ways a history of various industries ceasing, and we don't like that, and understandably, and people are nervous about it, and we can think particularly of coal, which is kind of the poster child for a lot of these issues. But it's a poster child because it's visceral and it's real, and communities are really been struggling for a long time and continue to struggle and are really struggling to find new work. And I think that's something where, we can get into the nitty-gritty on the realities of coal is just not economically viable anymore, and that, we can pretend whichever way we like that, there's this way to save it or that way to save it, when it's just the reality is there are cheaper ways to make energy. But this is not going to be the only case of this kind of issue. This is not, and many people are aware of this. This is not news. There are groups even here in Texas who are already really thinking about what does an after X industry look like? What are these jobs going to be? How do we carry over that skilled labor, those good jobs, that high paying, especially here in Houston? We worry about oil and gas and if some of those jobs are going to go away in the future. And so I'm curious if you have, either from history or from, your research and your work, what are strategies that we should be looking to adopt? And maybe some of that's the Green New Deal, maybe some of that's other things we haven't discussed or other ways of just thinking about this. But I'm really curious about what does that future of, good employment look like for people who are understandably very worried about their livelihood?
I think it's interesting because you're right. The coal industry is kind of the poster child for this. And it's somewhat ironic because, of course, the coal industry is where we've seen some of the most brutal labor fights in American history. And part of me wonders if kind of popular attachment to the coal industry has to do with the fact that it is a site for working class militancy and a site where people could articulate a kind of identity and community that actually is quite difficult, I think, in American society in a lot of ways. And I was thinking about this, yesterday I went to the rodeo, and I it was my first time, and I was really enjoying every aspect of it. But something I was thinking about was how much oil and gas, not just companies, but the kind of iconography of the oil and gas industry was present at this event that otherwise doesn't necessarily need oil and gas to exist. And it made me, I think, understand how much these energy materials can get embedded into our sense of ourselves and our sense of community. Part of why in my own research I approach these questions from a cultural studies or even a literary studies perspective is because, when we're talking about the economy, we're also talking about people's identities, how they relate to one another, how they think of themselves, and how they project themselves into the future. So I think these questions are quite thorny and can feel very existential for people.
People who work in coal specifically say is that they take pride not in mining coal specifically, although there are some specific identity and cultural attachments around that material, but in keeping the lights on for Americans, making sure that people can go about their daily lives. What's underpinning a lot of this attachment is actually a really admirable ethic of care, a desire to make sure that people are cared for. And as Claire said, it's also an ethic of solidarity. Feeling like we're providing for the community, we're creating a sense of coherence, we're doing things for ourselves, and we have power to determine our own future. All of these things are worth affirming. And so the question is, how do you take these incredibly admirable impulses that sustain currently some opposition to an energy transition and use it to organize for a transition that affirms those impulses and tries to build economies and ways of life that are actually more centrally organized around them than the coal industry is, right? Because in some ways, the coal industry gives an approximation of some of those things, or people kind of claw those things out of an industry that's very exploitative. But perhaps there are ways to center those things and make them the point of production, the point of our economy, rather than an incidental side effect. And I'll say one more thing. There's another concept in the social science literature around this called blackmail. We all have a sense of what blackmail is, but in the energy industry very specifically, it's the threat, often implicit, that if workers agitate too much around plant safety, health, or even broader environmental issues, that the plant is going to shut down or offshore or descale or something like that. So another question is, how do you combat this sense of blackmail, right? Which really derives from the fact that the firms have exclusive control over, or not totally exclusive, but have a lot of control over whether or not people even have a job. And some research I've done on labor union environmental movement collaborations in Louisiana in the 1980s suggests that when you have labor unions working with environmental justice groups and coming together around a shared sense of not just environmental quality, but also we want to determine what kinds of industries are here. We want to determine how they operate. And we want to make sure that they provide good jobs that also don't pollute the local environment. When you're able to foster those kinds of coalitions, you're able to break that sense of blackmail because people feel like they actually have some say over what kinds of jobs they have. And one case I look at, just very briefly, is a group called the Labor Neighbor Project, which developed in the mid '80s in Geismar, Louisiana. It was a collaboration between the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, the Delta chapter of the Sierra Club, and some majority black churches in Ascension Parish. And they came together after BASF, which at the time was the world's largest chemical manufacturer, refused the workers' contract demands. They wanted better pay and everything. And instead of signing a contract with the workers, locked them out. Locked them out for 5 years, the longest lockout in U.S. history. And for anyone who doesn't know, a lockout is like the inverse of a strike, where the employer refuses to let people come to work. And there were many different responses that the OCAW could have had to the lockout. But instead of doubling down on their old jobs and being really defensive and conceding to the idea that we need the chemical industry in order to live, they worked with these environmental groups to create a different vision of what good work looked like. And by the end of this lockout, you had people who'd worked in the chemical industry for many years saying, if all we can get are dirty jobs, we don't want these jobs. Like, we want clean jobs. We want different jobs. And in that case, Ascension Parish is still a work in progress, to say the least.
That's a bit of an understatement, but yeah.
But it created a template for organizing that has continued through the 90s and up until today.
Well, to that point, I'm wondering if you can point us to, and we're starting to come to the end of our time, but if you can point us to other examples of ways that you think this nexus of labor and environmental justice, climate justice work can actually, where is there opportunity for these groups to work together and to help shape a cleaner future for us and one in which people feel secure in the work they're doing and feel, valued. And I think some of what you were talking about earlier with that, just that attachment to jobs, that's real. People feel that desire for meaningful work and work that they, absolutely jobs are a part of identity. And so how can labor help to steer us to a world in which people feel both fulfilled and validated in their careers and safe in their careers with well-paying, meaningful jobs, and at the same time that are exactly doing what you're suggesting of advancing these goals of climate and environmental justice?
I think part of answering that question requires looking actually outside a lot of the industries that are most closely associated with a just energy transition, and specifically looking at what are sometimes referred to as pink collar jobs. So not blue collar, not white collar, but pink collar. So people who work in healthcare and education kind of make up the bulk of this sector, and sometimes are referred to as kind of doing reproductive labor, right? They're not necessarily producing commodities or producing things that we need, but they provide essential services for the functioning of our economy. And these jobs are mostly low carbon, right? If you're a teacher, you don't have an enormous carbon footprint to your job, although you don't have nothing, but you're not polluting in the same way that we think of, maybe the chemical industry or the fossil fuel industry as polluting. And these industries, I think, have a really important role to play, not only because they're already, low carbon and kind of model the kinds of jobs we would like to see more of in a regenerative economy or in a low carbon economy, but also because they're the industries where we've seen real growth in union membership and also a growth in union militancy. For me, some of the most exciting labor fights over the past couple of years have been with teachers, right? We've seen these huge strikes, UTLA, the Chicago Teachers Union, Red for Ed. I mean, really, in a way that also feels very nonpartisan, I think, as well, which is important. We've really seen teachers build coalitions with parents, with their students, with their broader communities to protect education, but also in a model that's been called bargaining for the common good, kind of take, bread and butter contract fights about pay and hiring and policies on campus, and actually bargain for things that impact the community as a whole, right? So building out green space in a particular city, or ensuring that ICE or police aren't present on campuses, right? And kind of creating a scary environment for students. They're able to kind of broaden their picture of what unions can demand and who they can demand those things for, in a way that I think is really promising. You know, I can really picture CTU, Chicago's Teachers Union, you know, fighting for environmental measures to, you know, maybe protect or clean the air in Chicago, which, you know, with a lot of wildfires, you know, they've seen a couple really bad days over the past few.
I was living in Chicago during the last big strike of the CTU. So yes,
well, I hope you weren't there during some of their, big pollution days where, you know, people are advised to stay inside, you know, and so I just think that there's a way here for us to broaden how we think of, again, who unions fight for, what they fight for, and to also look at industries that maybe we don't associate with fossil fuels that much, but because they are kind of the seat of labor activity right now, where people are agitated, they are thinking really ambitiously about what unions can win. I think that's where a lot of the promise is right now.
And it feels like we're in a labor movement at the same time that it's, you know, the labor movement across the country has had a number of significant wins in the last couple of years, that it does seem like a viable and necessary conversation. Yeah.
If I could just add a couple of things to
Please.
that. You know, the bargaining for the common good also models precisely the thing that workers in, say, the energy industry would have to do in order to successfully exert some control or to strike, say.
What do you mean by that? Can you say more about, yeah.
Sure. So, you know, teachers, when they go on strike, they very directly disrupt the lives of their students and their students' parents. It's a very disruptive thing. And, you know, in some ways, it's akin to the sort of disruption that a highway blockade causes. But they go about it in a very different way. You know, they spend a long time, or historically they've spent a long time, many months, sometimes years, organizing with parents, organizing with people in the neighborhoods who their schools serve. One, to make sure they understand the reasons for the strike, which, as Clara is saying, go beyond just teacher issues and often concern the welfare of the students, even things like the environmental quality of the neighborhoods. And they build support from the parents, including by creating kind of alternative infrastructures for caring for the children during the day and things like that. So if we're thinking about, you know, what it would take to build the capacity for disruptions in other industries, disruptions which are aimed at winning more power for labor so that labor can have more say over how an industry develops or what kinds of industries are in a place, they'll need to learn from the teachers who, you know, were able to create the conditions for a disruption that everyone in the area, at least, or maybe not everyone, but many people in the area understood was ultimately for, you know, their benefit, a way to improve their power in the long run. And just, you know, some more examples. There are labor groups all over the U.S. that are trying to incorporate sort of climate demands into their work. So farm workers unions are advocating for temperature thresholds for work. So if the temperature goes above a certain degree point, work has to cease. You know, they're organizing around that, trying to get legislation. UPS drivers, when they were organizing last summer, part of what they were organizing around was getting fans or air conditioning in their trucks. And now that we have the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, Biden's signature climate policy, we have a bunch of money being infused, especially into southern states, for a renewable energy transition, EVs and batteries. And this creates an incredible opportunity for people to think about what it would take to organize in a way that uses that money to build out the industry to the benefit of workers in their communities. And one example of that is workers at a Bluebird bus factory in Georgia got some IRA money to transition the bus fleet to electric. And the workers there unionized, formed a union, and have been using this nascent union power to make sure that that transition is not only good for all of us, because now we have electric buses, but also good for that community, and provides good jobs and a future for people in that community. And that's what we want ultimately. We want this transition to be good for everyone.
Yeah. No, I think that's significant too. Just it's one of the things that we often in programs kind of acknowledging this, it's so big and messy and complicated, right? And it's like these issues are always touching on so many other issues, and you kind of sit there and it can often feel overwhelming. And actually what I find really inspiring about this is the idea that that messiness and that connectedness of how tied environmental issues are to a range and myriad of other concerns actually gives us leverage on both sides, that it says this is connected across and that we should be working towards these things together, and that this isn't some separate issue but is actually part of a larger conversation that we should all be advocating around a variety of topics on, which in some ways is actually quite empowering. So thank you for that framing.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've heard people say, the best time to organize workers is now. The best place to organize workers is wherever you're at. And I think in that framework, you can kind of leave some of the, Washington, realpolitik, lesser evils, lowering people's expectations, and actually just imagine and fight for the things you really want, which is what the labor movement is all about.
So that's the time we have, I'm afraid. But Dr. Claire Ravenscroft is Assistant Professor of American Literature and American Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and Dr. Casey Williams is Lecturer in Environmental Studies at Rice University. Dr. Ravenscroft, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Weston.
We'll now go over to our researcher, Siena, with a piece on infrastructure and resilience in Houston.
With the intensification of global warming, the frequency and severity of flooding events are on the rise, posing significant threats to coastal communities, and especially Houston. Today, we're diving into a fascinating project led by Dr. Dominic Boyer, a professor of anthropology at Rice University, who is spearheading a 3-year study on the transformative potential of collaborative community design in mitigating severe storm impacts.
So my name is Dominic Boyer. I'm an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist by training, but over the past 15 years or so, I've become very involved in the fields of energy humanities and environmental studies. So I'm not quite sure how I describe myself these days, but definitely somebody who cares a lot about climate resilience. And a lot of my research focuses both on how we can decarbonize our energy system and also adapt to the changes that are already coming our way because of climate change and its various permutations.
All right, so right now you're working on this 3-year-long project to examine how collaborative community design can mitigate severe storm impacts. What was your inspiration for this project?
So I've been doing work ever since Hurricane Harvey on adaptations to catastrophic flooding in Houston. If you lived through Hurricane Harvey, it was hard for that not to be a life-changing experience. And in my case, it had a lot of effects, but one of them was to make me want to do research closer to home. So the focus of my work in Houston has been both how people have decided whether to rebuild or relocate from their homes that flooded in Harvey, and more recently focusing on what's known as green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI, which are a set of techniques like bioswale, like rain gardens, like green roofs, like permeable pavement that seek to use natural capacities to assist us in efforts to make our neighborhoods and our homes more resilient to the increases in storm activity and rainfall that are associated with climate change.
Awesome. And can you talk more about the green stormwater infrastructure? So first of all, you gave us some examples, but what are some different types of green stormwater infrastructure that can be implemented in Houston?
Well, the good thing about Houston is that is probably the largest major American city in terms of its footprint, which means that we have a lot of sprawl, which is a downside in a lot of ways when trying to build resilient systems. But the one nice thing about it is because the sprawl has been very uneven, chaotic, some would say, there's a lot of patchwork out there. There's a lot of green spaces that are intermingled among the subdivisions and the highway systems and so on. So we have a lot of green space, maybe more green space per capita than many large American cities have to offer. And that green space can be utilized in different ways to help reduce risks of flooding. But we have to be intentional about it. We have to use good principles of urban design and good principles of community engagement to make the most of the greenness that is at our disposal.
And going back to this idea of collaborative community design and its potential in mitigating these severe storm impacts, because we know Houston is very, very flood prone. How do you envision this approach of like collaborative community design in fostering this resilience within more vulnerable and flood prone communities?
I think one thing we're sure of in Houston after Hurricane Harvey is that our current way of thinking about flood control is broken. We have for too long allowed flood control to be a domain of experts, governed by engineers and political actors to some extent, but really mostly engineers, mostly the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Harris County Flood Control District. And I'm not criticizing the work that they're doing. The work that they're doing is important, but it's not been sufficient. So we had the largest, most ambitious program of flood defense in the past quarter century was Project Braze, which was a $200 million plus 20-year plus effort to defense the Braze Bayou watershed against catastrophic flooding. And the Braze Bayou still ended up being one of the two most heavily flooded and damaged bayous during Harvey. So it's not to say that all that work didn't help somewhat, but it's not actually adequate to the scale of the challenges we're facing because of the length of time involved in conventional stormwater infrastructure. Oftentimes you're planning for conditions that you were making estimates about 20 years ago instead of using the most up-to-date data. Green stormwater infrastructure is a nimbler process. It's not as expensive to make, it's not as large scale, and it actually really not only rewards community direct engagement from communities, but actually enables it too, because there's smaller projects that might help flooding on a block or even just a single home. Green stormwater infrastructures can be hyper local in ways that really enable community participation. So even if it's still probably going to be the case that we continue to let engineers do a lot of the heavy lifting in Houston, there actually are amazing opportunities now to activate the civil power of our communities to begin to engage us all in what I like to call infrastructural citizenship. That is getting people involved in infrastructure projects as sort of part of our activity as Houstonians. And I know in a perfect world, we might not have to do that, but this isn't a perfect world for all sorts of reasons. And this is actually a way that we can focus our civic engagement to make our city healthier, more resilient, as, frankly, the long-term projections look more and more scary from the point of view of a low-lying coastal city that suffers already from subsidence. In other words, it's sinking at the same time that the waters are rising and the storms are getting more intense. Houston really needs all the help it can get, and green stormwater infrastructure is part of that process.
So this is obviously a project that has just recently started. Can you tell me a little bit more about what is the overarching research question that is guiding this project for you, and what are the kind of key themes that the project is aiming to address? I know you touched on some parts a little bit already, but I'd love to hear more.
Basically, the premise of this grant is whether the combination of participatory urban design, which means engaging communities not after the fact, not showing people a completed project design and saying, hey, do you like this or not, but trying to solicit community input iteratively from the first stages of the project, so that what we're doing in terms of designs for urban engagement and transformation are always listening to community input, community ideas, because who knows these neighborhoods better than the people who live there? Certainly I don't. So that is part one. Part two is the green stormwater infrastructure part. In other words, can we put together participatory urban design together with green stormwater infrastructure in a way that will make especially some of Houston's historically disadvantaged and under infrastructured, under supported communities, often poor communities, communities of color around town. They're often the communities that have flooded the worst. And so where we're starting the project is in Northeast Houston, in the Trinity Houston Gardens and Kashmir Gardens super neighborhoods, which are places that, especially Kashmir, really catastrophically flooded in Harvey. I mean, really almost, whole blocks were flooded in Harvey, whole areas of this neighborhood. And a lot of people left. Can't blame them. A lot of people couldn't stay and rebuild. They left. And so it really devastated the community, not only in terms of its population, but in terms of its economy to have so many people move. And long term, the demographic trends of these areas are downward because of the flood risk. So it's really threatening existentially these communities. But in terms of conventional infrastructure, there's only really been one major project that's been accomplished, Project Hunting, which was recently completed based on the $2 billion flood bond that came out after Hurricane Harvey, which is great. But that project was first outlined in a bill in 1948, and it was finished in 2023. So you can do the math. It took 75 years for this neighborhood to find its first major conventional stormwater infrastructure project. And that's just not good enough for all sorts of reasons. And so we have to fight against not only the environmental racism that a lot of these neighborhoods face, where there are facing air pollution from concrete batch plants and cancer clusters from legacy creosote pollution from rail yards, but also, underinvestment, and you could call it infrastructural racism too, in the sense that infrastructure is not being put in areas that are poorer and viewed as less politically powerful than some of the more affluent areas of town. So we're really trying to concentrate this project on, if you will, those three pillars: trying to help out disadvantaged neighborhoods, trying to see what green stormwater infrastructure can do to reduce flood risk, and finally, what brings it all together is participatory design. In other words, not having experts sort of doing things on behalf of people, but trying to engage people in the process of creating designs for their community futures.
I really love this idea of engaging communities, because obviously, like as you were saying, like this is something that historically, like engineers have been working on, like their huge infrastructure projects. But I think it's really great that you guys are narrowing down to focusing really on community participation and community input. Could you share any insights or lessons you learned so far in your early stages of this project? And what are some things that have excited you as you've moved forward with this project?
Well, one of the plans we have, and this is actually a plan that precedes this grant, it was involved a grant. The principal investigator of that grant was Dr. Jessica Eisma from the University of Texas, Arlington, and I was a researcher, part of her research team for a previous green stormwater infrastructure grant. But I think that this is a long-term project that it's going to sort of merge over into the work we're doing now. And that project is about trying to create ways to work with local schools to get students and their families to understand more about what green stormwater infrastructure might be able to do, to learn the techniques by actually doing them, by creating a community rain garden. In this case, our partner is Kashmir High School, and to try to work with the high school and their science club on developing a program that would allow us and them to work together in terms of spreading information, learning skills, getting kids to see how hydrology works, how engineering also can be part of the solution, but also simple things like digging a hole in the ground and putting in logs and leaves and creating a rain garden that can help to detain water for periods of time in high volume stormwater situations. There are a lot of things that we could do by working with schools that would get us into contact with a lot of people in these neighborhoods. And we'd love for that project to be one that doesn't stop at one high school, but really could expand out, working through HISD to work in a lot of different neighborhoods if we can prototype it effectively in the Northeast. But I think that's something that really excites me because it's a chance to take the science and the social science that we're doing here at Rice and to find ways working together with community partners to get that work and those insights and that knowledge out there into situations where it can be directly meaningful and helpful to people, keeping their homes dry, giving them a sense of more control over weather systems that are scary for all of us. Let's be honest, but not everyone has the same resources to defense their homes and their neighborhoods. And in places where people have fewer resources, it's all the more important that we in elite institutions like Rice really step up and try to do what we can do to help, not just kind of, on a one-off basis, but really to set up our own infrastructure to help, continuing to enable folks to achieve higher levels of climate resilience. It's a big struggle and it's a really complex problem, but it's work I feel both very excited about intellectually and also find very fulfilling as a researcher who also likes to work in communities here in Houston.
Awesome. Well, I'm really looking forward to see the project grow in the next couple years, but thank you so much for being here today and talking to me about this.
Thank you, Sienna. It was great to talk to you.
And lastly, we'll turn to Sienna again, who's going to tell you how you can get involved in Houston this week.
Hey everyone, this is Sienna coming to you with some upcoming opportunities to get involved. Looking for ways to make a difference in your community? Look no further than Memorial Park Conservancy. Nationally distinctive for its size, location, and composition as an urban wilderness and active recreation park, Memorial Park spans an impressive 1,500 acres. It's Houston's largest urban center park. But Memorial Park isn't just about size. It's about the unique blend of urban wilderness and recreational space it offers. With approximately 30 miles of trails, including a 600-acre urban wilderness, it's a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. Now, take the opportunity to join Memorial Park Conservancy on Thursday, March 14th from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. for Land Bridge and Prairie Conservation Horticulture Volunteer event. Be sure to sign up as a volunteer on their volunteer tab of their website. By becoming a volunteer at Memorial Park Conservancy, you are joining an organization dedicated to the restoration, preservation, and enhancement of Memorial Park. You'll learn insider tips on gardening in Houston's natural climate while participating in tasks like pruning, seed collection, planting, trash pickup, and invasive species removal. It's a hands-on opportunity to contribute to the preservation of this beautiful urban wilderness. Don't forget to bring a water bottle, snacks, sunscreen, hat, sunglasses, gardening gloves, or bug spray for your personal comfort. Closed-toed shoes or boots and long pants are required. Please wear clothes that can get dirty and are weather appropriate. Parking is available for $2 for 3 hours. Paid parking is through the Park Houston mobile app or in-person kiosks. And meet in the center of the parking lot, then walk to the work site. If you have any questions, email volunteer@memorialparkconservancy.org or give them a call at 713-863-8403. They can't wait to see you there.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about a new power generator in town that doubles as a public artwork. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email me at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.